You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How are you?
Doing good.
We did several episodes about naysayers, those that don't believe mold's a problem, and we did one about stress, and then we did one about coaching. So great topics for our listeners. You know, I wanted to cover those topics because I deal with a lot of clients. I see a lot of posts on Facebook. I can say, hey, go listen to this episode. So today we're going to get back to diving deep into mold. And today's topic is the truth about DIY toxic mold removal. How often do you hear me talk about this?
A lot, because a lot of people really think that they can YouTube how to do adequate mold remediation. And we're going to talk about the truth about that today.
Yeah. And, I want to be clear with our listeners. I totally get it. I understand. One of the most common things I hear is we can't afford to hire a professional. Well, we talked about, I had that rotor-rooter surgery, I don't know, long enough ago that I still remember, or not long enough is probably a better way of saying it. But I knew I needed a rotor-rooter surgery on my sinuses. I didn't try to do that myself, did I?
No, certainly not.
I guess my point behind that is I get it. If you don't have the money, then you feel like you're in a position where you have to do it on your own. And it just brings up a simple question. I'll just ask you and then I'll chime in. But why is it a bad idea?
Well, because most people don't know what they're doing.
Exactly. And they think they can watch a YouTube video. Mm-hmm. They can go out and buy an air scrubber. It's interesting. I've had clients that do it. My point is at the end of the day, anybody can go buy whatever. But they'll buy an air scrubber and they buy the cheap $600 air scrubber. Then I see it, they send me a picture, and I'm like, wow, that thing's tiny. Ours are like twice the size. Obviously, we do it commercially, professionally. My point is yeah, you can go buy an air scrubber, and you can buy an ozone machine. You can buy chemicals. You can buy plastic sheeting. But at the end of the day, there's more to mold remediation than just cutting stuff out.
Agreed. And it even starts with the mold testing. So many people will come to you and say, I bought an at-home mold test kit from Home Depot or Lowe's. Could you just shed a little light on the differences between what they could do with that kind of test kit versus what you do?
So the DIY, what you're talking about is like a mold armor kit or immunolytics. It's a Petri dish, and I'll admit, years and years and years ago, before I even got certified as a mold inspector, I actually used to do the agar plate testing. But anyhow, it's an agar plate, so it's a Petri dish. You open it up, you leave it out for an hour, you close it up. You're supposed to put it in a dark, cool, damp area. Damp shouldn't matter. That's what the media is. Usually it's potato dextrose. Anyhow, you put it wherever underneath your stairs where it's nice and cool, no sunlight. You're supposed to let it sit there. If you don't see any mold on it, you just assume there's no mold in your house. Once again, if someone comes to me and says, yeah, I did this DIY test and there was no mold growing in my house, I can tell you right off the bat, they didn't test properly or they didn't wait long enough. Period. Like, there's no such thing as no mold in a home. Now, if I was to go into a lab or maybe a cancer center and go into their operating room, I maybe could do an air test and there would be no mold in there. But even then, that would be highly unlikely. And my point is there's no such thing. Mold is naturally present in the air. But what you're looking at is what we call a viable sample. So it's colonizing, it's reproducing, you can see it growing, it's nice and fluffy, it's alive and thriving. What we do on the professional side, we do non-viable testing, which literally we have low volume air pumps. There's all sorts of different brands. There's even DIY kits for that. It's called My Mold Detective. You can buy right off of Amazon. You buy an aerosol cassette, you pull the air through that cassette for an outside sample, 10 minutes. Some companies only do it for 5 minutes. For an indoor sample, 5 minutes, unless it's really dusty, then you do it for 2 or 2.5. That's all non-viable. We take that cassette, we send it off to our lab. We use different labs. All depends on what we're doing. But my point is we send it right to a lab. One of the labs we use, it's same day turnaround time. They literally pop open that cassette. There's a slide in the middle of it, like a slide you look at under your microscope. They look at it, they analyze it, and they give us the results. That is non-viable, meaning they're only looking at things underneath a microscope. So think about the difference between that and then the Petri dish. The Petri dish has nice fluffy molds growing. Some are, going to be green, some are white, some are darker in color, but there's a big difference. The reason we test the way we do is because, like if we're doing PRV testing, our clients are waiting to get and I don't want to say all clear, but that's kind of how it's worded, to go back into the home. If we had to wait for the Petri dish testing, it would literally take up to 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So did I answer your question?
You did, but I guess I can certainly hear that there would be somebody listening to this that would say, well, if I can buy all of the mold testing equipment that Steve has, what's to say that I can't do the same tests and get accurate results? What's your response to that?
Well, they could absolutely do that, but it probably ends right at that. So my point is they can get the test results back and they have probably never looked at a lab report.
Well, I go before
that. Does that make
sense? I would say, how would I know for sure, having never done mold testing, even if I had your same equipment? Did I do the test in the right space outside and the right space inside? Like, yes, you can watch YouTube videos.
Was the HVAC on?
But I don't understand exactly how it's supposed to be done. So the room for error for me would be so much bigger, even with your equipment.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of, and I've done it before, even recently, we do PRV testing, but we didn't do the cool down period or anything. And remember when I explained that to you, I'm not sure if you remember this, so I'm not going to ask you, but I said to you, there are so many variables. If I go in and do that testing, and I'm just giving you this situation, they could have been running an air scrubber right up until right when I got there. They could have had a fogger running in there for 3 hours till right before I got there. They could have had an ozone machine in there. So my point is that would skew the numbers on our PRV test. So to go back to what you said, there are so many variables when it comes to mold testing that for the listener that thinks they can go out and buy the equipment, that's fine. But at the end of the day, you're probably not going to understand air pressures in your home. You probably don't understand that air testing by itself is not accurate. Certain molds like Stachybotrys, which Stachybotrys is the black mold. A lot of people call it toxic mold, but as you know, there's many mold types and species that are toxic. But my point is Stachybotrys is a heavier, tackier mold. So that would require more of dust sampling or tape lifts. You're not always going to pick up Stachybotrys in an air test.
Exactly.
So to answer your question, like there's just so many variables that when I get even PRV test results back from a remediation project we did, if there's a bunch of red flags in it, I can't just definitively answer the question. I don't think that our listener who just went out and bought the equipment would know how to answer the questions. Why were there red flags in the PRV testing? Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Whereas I know what I'm looking at. I do this all the time. I can say, well, did you run it inside the containment? Were you outside the containment? If you were outside the containment, was the HVAC system running through the remediation process? Had the ducts been cleaned? Like, there's tons of variables. So to answer your question, for our listeners, you absolutely can go out and buy the kit, but you're probably going to have to pay me for a consultation to interpret your results.
Correct. If you didn't have a mold professional actually running the tests and then the results seem a bit off, then you just have to pay more money to actually bring that IEP in to do that. But then what about the mold remediation? Because more and more I'm hearing people watching YouTube videos and getting in Facebook groups and, asking for play-by-plays on how to do mold remediation. And what I'm at least seeing is that a lot of what people are doing is not necessarily mitigating the mold, but covering it up.
Yeah, and I deal with that quite often too. When we do a mold remediation project, we provide for our client an SOW, which is scope of work. You can call it protocols, a work plan, however you want to word it. We provide that. And so when we go in and do remediation, we don't willingly leave a mold behind, but we're very specific on what we're cutting out. Because as I say all the time, mold is the gift that keeps on giving. But let's say that, we did everything in our scope of work. We do the PRV testing. There's red flags. Well, then the homeowner decides, well, we just saw what Steve did, so we're going to go buy the equipment. They typically think that all they have to do is run an air scrubber, and the mold that they think we left, which was never verified, gets encapsulated. They think that they're doing a good thing.
And then the tests come out great, right? Because you basically covered up the mold.
You encapsulate it,
So you sort of, encapsulating the mold is kind of like putting a bubble wrap around it.
Mm-hmm.
So because you put bubble wrap around it by encapsulating it, it won't come up on a test.
Initially, yeah. And so initially it might not because you encapsulated it. Well, encapsulation is the last resort for us. If we can do things to cut it out, sand it, abrasively remove it, we're going to do that. But if you have to encapsulate it, so let's say they did what you just said. They encapsulated it, they run air tests, or let's say even we run air tests. Everything looks fine. They're like, yep, see, we did exactly what Steve and his guys could do. Well, then you put insulation back in there, you put the sheetrock back up, more or less, it's encapsulated, you cover it up. Well, what's to say that maybe you really didn't encapsulate it all the way it should have been done? And now, under certain, once again, this is why we don't like DIY, under certain air pressures, there's enough, like a microburst of air, let's say when your HVAC system kicks on, or the analogy I always use with air pressures, if you have a window cracked in your kid's bedroom and you come in the front door, that door just slams shut. Well, that's because what the air pressures are doing. It's a microburst. Mm-hmm. And my point is there could be a small microburst where the mold that you thought you encapsulated in the wall, there's a microburst and the air pressure quickly changes from, let's just say, neutral to negative. You can pull that air out of that wall cavity and there you go. You're being exposed to it again.
100%.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
That's the problem with encapsulation. And once again, it's funny because you know this. I'm not mechanically inclined. There are a few things I'm okay doing on my own. The reason why I don't like doing stuff mechanically, and I'm sure our listeners will agree with me on this, I start a project and then I get partway through and I'm like, you know what? I don't even remember how to put that back together. So what happens? I have to go pay a professional.
Exactly.
And at the end of the day, the time I spent, the stress that it caused me, I might as well just pay the professional to do it. And I get it with mold remediation. It's a difficult thing, especially money-wise. But at the end of the day, what you think is a good thing, it will backfire. 9 times out of 10, it will backfire on you.
100%. And I do think one of the reasons why you offer things like mold consults and the VPAs is because it's a more affordable step. that a client can take so that they understand what needs to be done with the more expensive stuff. They have a plan for what needs to be done. And so they can go into preparing for the financial investment of the more expensive stuff because your expertise has been in the mix to help them figure out what should come next.
Well, and the thing is it brings up a good subject. A lot of times I hear we don't have the money, and then I ask, well, have you reached out to your insurance company, your homeowner's insurance? And they're like, yeah, they told us no, they don't cover mold. A lot of times, when those clients reach out to me, I say, well, call them, and we've done episodes about this. So I'm speaking specifically to a moisture intrusion event that happened because of a defective water line, a pipe burst. When it comes to flooding, they won't cover that.
Exactly.
But a lot of times, and I guess my point is reach out to us, book a consultation or hire me to do a scope of work, which is literally a work plan that I create. You can typically go to your insurance company, and once again, this is if it was a broken water line or something like that. You could go to them and just say, what do you cover for water damage? What do you cover for drying out? They call it dry logs. What do you cover for replacing the carpet? What do you cover for removing it? My point is most of the time we can get insurance to cover it. But as a listener or the homeowner, if you call the insurance company and say, do you cover mold? They're going to say, no, we don't.
Exactly.
That's not in our policy. Once again, there are policies that maybe they only cover $5,000 or $10,000. But most of the time we can get the insurance company to cover things that our listeners thought wouldn't be covered. So that's what helps about reaching out to someone like myself, because I know, how to word things, what to say. If it's an insurance issue, it really doesn't happen very often. But even if their insurance adjuster or claims rep or company, whatever you want to call them, if they want to reach out to me, I'm more than willing to get on the phone and see if we can get it covered.
Absolutely. And I think before I ask you for the call to action, I just want to hit home on one point you touched on a little bit, but I want to make sure that we sort of clarify. I think sometimes when people are requesting mold remediation, mold mitigation, there is some belief that it works any different than any other project that people pay for. When you go to a general contractor and you say, hey, I want you to custom build me this house, the general contractor takes the blueprint and they give you an estimate of what the house is going to cost with all the materials that you say you want. Now, if all of a sudden you take Formica countertops and you make them granite, that changes the price of the house. If all of a sudden you want triple pane windows instead of single pane, that changes. All of a sudden you want 9-foot ceilings instead of 8, that changes the price. And I think sometimes people think that when they get that first bid or first quote or statement of work for somebody who's doing mold mitigation, that, well, they're just supposed to get rid of all of the mold. No. A scope of work from a project management perspective indicates the scope of the work to be done. And mold is notoriously something for which there are lots of change orders, because once you get into the job and you start removing walls and floors, you actually learn that the scope is larger than initial inspection, because in initial inspection, you don't remove the walls and the floors.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's, that's the issue I deal with quite often on the remediation side. And even clients, like, we didn't do the remediation. They're like, well, they left mold behind. Well, it's easy to say that and think that it's the remediation company's fault. Trust me, I've dealt with jobs that the remediation company literally left mold on a baseboard that should have obviously been done in their scope of work. But on the other hand, if it's outside of our scope of work, like, we're obviously, if we think it's mold, we're going to contact you and say, hey, this is a change order. But on the other hand, going back to what you said, they just kind of think that we're going to get rid of all the mold concerns.
At the same price.
Yeah.
I think that's the key piece, at the same price. And as much as mold mitigation is expensive, it costs a lot of money, I think people need to prepare themselves for it could cost more.
Right.
Because you don't know what you can't see with the eye. And like, the test tells you something's going on, but until your crew actually gets behind the wall and gets underneath the floor and underneath the subfloor, if there are other subfloors, the full extent of the mold mitigation, the mold remediation, is not fully known until the job starts. And on top of that, if a client only wants to pay a certain amount of money, then the scope won't change
Yeah.
if they're adamant about only wanting to pay a certain amount of
Yeah,
money.
it brings up something I'll just touch on real quickly. It's not uncommon, and I get it. Once again, it's not cheap, but we're in there, we're doing the mold remediation. It's in our contract. They have to respond within 24 hours for change order requests. Well, if I reach out to that client and they're like, well, I don't know why, you want to remove our carpets. Well, first and foremost, I probably already had the conversation before we did the remediation. Carpets should come out. Well, then I contact them and I'm like, yeah, we found some mold on, underneath the carpet. The carpet and pad needs to come out. Well, if they give me a bunch of pushback on that, they're telling me clearly, no, we don't want to spend any more money. Well, at that point, like you said, they're only going to get what was in our original scope of work. Now, we don't willingly leave mold behind, but, for our listeners, understand that from the remediation contractor's view. There's a lot we don't know until we start cutting things out. But if you're going to expect the contractor to do it for no extra fees, that's on you. Like, you're knowingly saying, hey, I don't really care.
Well, and I also think it's an important call out. I know that there are a lot of mold mitigation IEP professionals who listen to this podcast. It's an important call out for those professionals too, because sometimes I think in your frame of mind, you think I emailed them the statement of work, they should know. Like,
right.
I've talked to them about it, they should know. I think IEPs and those who are doing this work need to really have a lengthy conversation and explain like you're explaining to a kindergartner. This is what a scope of work is. This is what a scope of work means. When you sign on the dotted line, this is the scope. We know there could be change orders, and every change order you'll be made known if we find something that it changes the scope, and it will be an additional cost.
Yeah.
If you choose to not do the additional cost, the additional work will not get done.
Yeah, and it brings up, I know we're going longer than normal, but it brings up a really good point too. This is why it's really important, and we've talked about it in previous podcasts. For our listeners, it's really important to have a scope of work. And the reason why is you can take that scope of work that you give to 3 different mold remediation contractors, and they're all bidding on the same work. I can go in and do a bid, and I know that we're going to take, A, B, and C out. And let's say my bid's $12,000. Well, the next guy can go in and be like, we're going to do the minimum. And we're not going to take out the carpet. And we're only going to take out a 2-foot flood cut. We're not going to go up to 3 feet. And they bid it for $8,000. Well, they get the job normally because they're cheaper. But if you don't have a scope of work, then it wasn't fair to me to bid more work. And on top of that, that contractor is probably going to ding you with $4,000 in change orders. So you're at the $12,000 anyways.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
That
And
makes
so,
sense.
I was going to talk about, after our call to action, one of the services that I'm not specific on it on our website, but I do offer scope of work packages. And literally it's bringing me on, and it can be as a third-party consultant for the remediation process or for specifically only a scope of work. And more or less what that is for our listeners, it typically includes a VPA. And I'm going to see where we think that the mold remediation needs to happen. I'll have, I'll say a 3-foot flood cut. You're going to remove how many ever square feet. And my point is that scope of work does 2 things. It's specific as to what's going to happen for the remediation as far as measurements. But on top of that, it includes things like a containment should be established. HVAC vents need to be taped off. The containment is 6 mil plastic. Throughout the entire project, you have to have negative air or an air scrubber. I guess my point is the scope of work is fairly specific too as to what needs to happen.
Awesome.
And so for our listeners that haven't been through the process, they can go to their potential mold remediation contractor and say, here's the scope of work, and that's exactly what I want you to do.
Now give me a price
Exactly.
on it.
And so it really helps for people that, they say they do everything to IICRC standards. Well, if you're giving your contractor a scope of work, we're specific on the steps you're going to take. So if they didn't put up the proper containments and all your furniture's full of mycotoxins, you have a document to go back on and say, hey, I sent you the scope of work.
Exactly.
Makes sense?
Makes sense.
And so I'm in the business, obviously. It's always CYA all the time, but it's an interesting topic that we kind of went down. So anyhow, that was a little longer than normal, but my whole thing is for those of you that want to do mold remediation on your own, don't do it.
Yep.
And for those of you that are interested in the scope of work plan, however you want to term it, if you want a package like that, reach out to us at info@cnccontractorservices.com. I'll get back to you and I'll say, okay, if this is what you need, we'll provide it for you and give you a price.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you for all you listeners. We appreciate every one of you. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.